Hey everyone, I wanted to come on here today and talk about something that I am pretty passionate about. And it's not that I'm super passionate about this specific thing, but I think it's something that gets overlooked a lot, and that in my own life and in my own journey, I have kind of noticed that I just don't feel like it's pointed out enough. And that is wolves in sheep's clothing. And I think, when I say that, a lot of people think they know what I'm talking about, and I think they think they know what I'm gonna say, and in reality they don't. And so I think I kind of want to give maybe a different or more clear and precise view of this topic. And I'm somebody who for the past year I've been kind of going on my own healing journey, and I've learned a lot, and I've heard a lot, and I've seen a lot, and a lot has happened to me in the past few years, and I feel like I've collected all these lessons, and I kind of need to start putting them out into the world. And so this is kind of the start of that, and this first lesson is about wolves in sheep's clothing. And so to start things off, I've kind of noticed this trend just within society where, when we tend to think about bad people, we have this very overt and obvious definition or idea of what these people can be and what these people can act like and how they behave. And so the one I always see is this overt bad guy, the name calling, the people who yell, people who gossip, that person who if you go to a restaurant and they happen to be your waitress and they're glaring at you, people who are overtly snake in the road mean. And that term snake in the road, there's somebody who I watch here on YouTube named Dana Morningstar, and she's absolutely amazing. You all need to go check her out if you have not heard of her, Dana Morningstar. And she uses this analogy, and it's one that has existed, but I think she's just elaborated on it very well throughout her career on YouTube. And it's this whole idea that there are snakes in the road, and then there are snakes in the grass. And when you see a snake in the road, you can see it from a mile away. And even if you couldn't see it from a mile away, you could see it enough to navigate it and go around it or to avoid it. Versus when there's a snake in the grass, there's not necessarily that opportunity. It's just tangled up in the grass, and you're walking along your way, and next thing you know, you step on a snake or you get bit. And it's one of those things where it's almost like an ambush. And I'm going to take this analogy a step further, because let's just say not only is this a snake in the grass, but maybe the snake is green. It's the color of the grass. And let's just also say that maybe there's a snake in the grass, but it's red or it's pink. And so as you're walking, it's a snake in the grass, but you can see it. But when you have a green snake in the grass, good luck. And they're hard to spot, and they're hard to point out, and they are just low to the ground. And it's one of those things where you really have to train your eye to see them. In society, we tend to also do this thing where we take people at face value. We look at people, and when they show us their face and when they show us who they are, we take them, we believe them. And it's weird because what people don't understand, and this is something my father taught me, when you meet people, you're not really meeting them, you're meeting their representative. You're meeting a version of them that is used to entice and bring in and to attract, and not necessarily who they are. Because when people get comfortable, they're completely different people. And I don't think people really realize that. And so it's very easy to be fooled by surface level niceness. It's really easy to meet a person and see oh, this person's nice to me, they're kind to me, they're friendly. But do not mistake niceness for sincerity, because their niceness is free, niceness is easy to give, it's talk is cheap. So niceness is one of those things that comes a dime a dozen. And it cannot, I repeat, it cannot be mistaken for actual sincerity. Sincerity is one of those things that is genuine. And I feel like people do not really know that there is this distinction between niceness, kindness, and sincerity. When you go to the grocery store, the cashier is typically nice to you, but that doesn't mean the cashier values you, and the cashier doesn't really have to value you. I mean, you don't really know them. But I just use that analogy because I almost equate niceness to politeness. And so, you should be polite to people. You should be nice to people. So you don't get brownie points for being nice. But you don't necessarily get brownie points, but there is value in sincerity, for sure. And just as a side note, you are not obligated to be polite or kind to people who actively go out of their way to abuse or hurt you. You do not owe them your energy. But I'm just saying, like, when you first meet a stranger, you're not gonna like bare your teeth. You're typically kind and polite, and so therefore, like, and that's expected. You know, when you're at the grocery store and you're checking out with the cashier, or like you have a waitress, or you're just walking down the street and you see somebody who you see a lot from your neighborhood, but you don't necessarily know their name, you might give a polite smile and say, hi, how are you? You know, kindness is something that's cheap. Sincerity is something that is not. And for me personally, I know this kind of hits home for me because, you know, growing up, I wasn't really ever shown a lot of kindness, and niceness was not something that was shown to me. And so as I got older, you know, I expected people to treat me badly. And it happened a lot. I experienced very little kindness growing up. And not just from the world, but also from my own family members and from my parents. And so kindness wasn't something I knew very well. And so when I got to college, you know, I met people who were nice to me and who were kind to me. And when I saw that they were nice and kind, I almost got like swept away and tackled into the bushes because I saw their kindness and I immediately was like, oh my God, you're being nice to me. That means you're a nice person. Like, awesome, let's be friends. And so then I'd invite these people into my life and into my inner sanctum, only to find out later down the road that they were really hurtful, bad people. And, you know, like I said before, these weren't people who were, like, obviously mean. And these weren't even people who, like, you know, they were nice when you first met them, but then they kind of just had like stinky personalities. Like, no, these were people who were very sly and very sneaky. Some more than others, some a little bit more overt, because you have to understand that this whole snake in the grass and snake in the road analogy comes in a spectrum. So there's like a spectrum of how people can behave and how people can be. So I'd advise you not to really get too stuck on binaries and to really understand that like bad people exist in a spectrum, good people exist in a spectrum, and at some point those spectrums do intersect, but it's one of those things where it's like you can't get too caught up in trying to define like this is a snake in the road, this is a snake in the grass. Like, some people are somewhere in between. And so some of the behaviors that I kind of picked out from these people, and I've seen this throughout my life, I've encountered these people before, but I could never really like nitpick why it was so hard for me to spot these people out when they were there. And I think gaslighting is a big part of that. Typically when you're meeting snakes in the grass, gaslighting is a big part of their ability to cloak themselves. And gaslighting, for those of you who don't know, is an abuse tactic that is essentially distorting somebody else's reality in an attempt to convince them that what you're doing isn't actually happening. And so it's a way, if you've ever heard somebody say, oh, you're too sensitive, or like, you're crazy, or like maybe like that never happened, you just imagine that, or like maybe you're just not seeing things right, or maybe let's just say you have a boyfriend and he hits you and you're like, hey Bobby, why'd you hit me? And he goes, I never hit you, you're crazy, you're just making stuff up to get attention, you're a liar. Those are all examples of gaslighting. It's a way to convince you that your perceptions are not correct and you're not seeing things properly. And so gaslighting doesn't even have to be verbal. It can literally just be somebody making you have cognitive dissonance or perpetual confusion, where you feel like you can't rely on your own senses in order to navigate what is happening or what is wrong or what is right. An example of like nonverbal gaslighting, I can think of a few off the top of my head, is like if somebody is doing something harmful to you, but before or after they do it, they go, oh, is this okay? Like, is this okay? Like, you know, if I'm ever hurting you, you can say that I am. You can let me know. You can talk to me. But then when you try and talk to them, they're really sensitive and fragile, and they get really aggressive and defensive whenever you bring things up with them. So they keep harming you, and they're like, well, you can talk to me. You can do this. But then, you know, every time you try and talk to them, they get aggressive and sensitive, or they weaponize their emotions, or they amplify vulnerability. Another example of this is somebody who, and for starters, this is kind of within the same vein as this last example, but somebody who cries whenever you try and confront them about their abusive behavior. You know, somebody who amplifies vulnerability when confronted with their own bad behavior, or when they're forced to be made aware of how they're treating others. And the gaslighting that's taking place here, or the manipulation that's taking place here, is this person is making it seem as though their mental health and stability and well-being relies on their ability to hurt and harm you. And so in that case, it's gaslighting, because they're putting you in this situation where if you make them feel bad, to them that means you're like trying to hurt them, which makes you the bad person, when in reality it doesn't. But that's how the game works. It's this whole idea that their whole identity requires you to commodify yourself, or requires you to allow them to hurt you, and when they can't hurt you, or you confront them with their hurtful behavior, they cry, make you feel guilty, make you feel like you're the bad guy, make you feel like you're the crazy one, make you feel like you're the hurtful one, when in fact none of that is true. And that's kind of how the gaslighting starts. A good example of that is like Barbecue Becky, the woman who called the police on a group of Black people for literally having a barbecue. And when she was confronted with her own bad behavior, she started to cry and pretend like she was being attacked and victimized, even though she was the one who was being abusive, and literally chose to call the police on a group of people simply because they were Black and existing in public. And so she was the bad guy. She was the person who was being abusive, toxic, was being racist, being harmful, being a horrible person, yet somehow ended up victimizing herself and making it seem as though she was the one who was being attacked or discriminated against, or whatever the case may be. Another example of this I can think of off the top of my head is somebody who constantly has to convince you that they're a good person. Like, have you ever met people and when you talk to them, they're always like, I'm such a good person, or like, oh my God, because I was such a good guy. If somebody's having to go out of their way to tell you they're a good person, it's probably because they're not a good person. And so be wary of people who have to announce who they are and like self-proclaim themselves as a good person, because that usually means they're not a good person. If somebody has to go out of their way to convince you and keep mentioning that they are a certain thing, it's probably because they are not that thing. And so that's another example of gaslighting. It's them trying to convince you of a certain reality, and typically these people will self-proclaim themselves as good people, but then will turn around and do very sneaky, divisive, harmful things and be like, well, I'm a good guy, and that's kind of how they get away with it and do this kind of tango. And so back to the friends I was talking about earlier, I kind of got on a tangent, but I wanted to list some of their behaviors, and I think I kind of went on that tangent because one of the behaviors was actually like gaslighting, because that's the main way in which all these other behaviors are able to exist. But the rest of these behaviors are kind of, the rest of these behaviors for snakes in the grass are essentially people who nitpick you and are hypercritical. So like, and I'm going to name a few, but there are tons more, but people who are kind of, you notice them watching you a lot, and they're always just observing you, and they always make sly remarks at you like, oh my God, you're so weird. Or they just like nitpick everything you do. Like, if you're, just going about your life, why do you do that like that? Like, that is so weird. Or they just assume that you aren't competent enough to live life on your own, so you need their guidance. So people who are very hypercritical, or if you're like wearing a certain shirt, they're like, oh, are you really gonna wear that? Like, everything requires criticism or commentary, or requires some type of comment, or they just are intimidated by you and they feel the need to try and find little ways to tear you down. And so that's an example of that. Another example is somebody who kind of projects their emotions onto you, somebody who kind of sees you as a therapist, and they spend all their time talking about themselves and their issues, and then they don't really give you space to talk about yourself, and they kind of make the entire relationship and or friendship, and yes, friendships can be abusive too, and this could also go for relationships with family members. But this person they make everything about them, and they also just take up a lot of space, and the whole conversation is always about them and nothing else. And when you kind of try and bring yourself to the table, they get very offended, or they act like you're taking space away from them, and everything just has to revolve around them. These are people who typically, they don't value you, but they value your ears. They want somebody who they can just talk at, but not a person who they can like have a mutual exchange of love and affection with. Like, they don't want a friend. They want, like I said earlier, they want a therapist. They don't value you. They value having somebody to talk at, or to talk, pretty much to talk at. kind of in that same vein, another example is somebody who kind of objectifies you. One thing I've dealt with a lot is people who kind of look at me and they see me and they kind of see me as this, like, I know, like, I don't really show my face here, but I'm somebody who, I'll say, I kind of stand out of a crowd, and not in a bad way. I'm somebody who I'm very, like, I wear a lot of bright colors. I'm somebody who physically stands out. A little bit about me, I am an artist, and so I don't know if that paints a picture of anybody. I know some people are like, oh, artists are crazy, but you know what? I'm just somebody who I stand out amongst a crowd just because I dress pretty colorfully, you know, I have my own aesthetic and sense of style, and I live in a place where a lot of people dress the same, and so I usually kind of stand out, and a lot of people stand out around where I live, but at the same time a lot of people don't, and so, you know, like, I stand out a little bit. And so sometimes people will see me and they'll kind of like objectify me a little bit, and they'll be like, they see me, they see the way that I dress, or they see that I like bright colors, or maybe they've seen some of my work in a show or something, and they'll kind of do this thing where it's like they don't really like me, they like the idea of me, they see me as this little trinket that they can pick up off the sidewalk and attach to their charm bracelet, and it's like they like see me, and I don't know what it is. It's not that I don't think I'm so great and I'm so like amazing, but they look at me and they like, as Dana Morningstar would say, they love bomb me. So they like, oh my god, you're so pretty, you're so cool, you do this, oh my god, and they oh my god, they kind of flatter me with all these compliments, you know, definitely make me feel special, but then it's in a very fetishy, objectifying way where they're not actually trying to get to know me as a person. They're just kind of obsessed with me and obsessed with how I look. And then once I become friends with these people, they kind of discard of me, you know, they treat me badly, they kind of do that last example where they might dump all their problems on me, or they nitpick everything that I do, but it's this whole idea that I am this trophy that can stand by their side. And, you know, this happens more in kind of relationship context, but it's this whole idea that the other person is this, or that you, rather, are this trophy that can stand by this person's side. And it's just like this shiny accessory that they can wear because you look cool, or maybe you are cool, or maybe, you know, you're in a band, or maybe, you know, you have a YouTube channel, or like whatever. It can be literally about anything. People's motives go on for days, and so it's not always necessarily, you know, something that you can put your finger on. Another example of these characteristics is like somebody who only calls you when they need something, or somebody who only seems to spend time with you when they need something or they need a favor. Another example is somebody who maybe is really, really clingy, and they don't really seem to value you or like you as a person, but rather as a kind of this thing to fill a void. And there's a common theme here. It's objectification, and people not really seeing you as a person, but rather as a resource that they can exhaust for their own, like, pitiful, sad needs. And remember, you're a person too. Your mental health matters too. You are not an object or a comfort object that other people can use to fix their lives. You know, I think we all have hard lives to different degrees. Some people do have harder lives than other people. Some people are very privileged, but it's one of those things where it's like, your mental health matters too, and your time matters too, and it is not your job to allow yourself to be swept away into other people's problems. Even if other people are having a hard time in life, ultimately that's their life and that's on them. And I'm not saying like it's your fault if your life sucks right now. I'm just saying, hey, other people aren't band-aids that you can slap on your leg when your knee hurts. You know, people are people, and you know, people aren't these creatures that only exist to make us feel better. You know, people have a bad habit of wanting to deconstruct us into these little parts and little pieces that are palatable to them. People don't want to accept us and love us as a whole. They want to just take the parts of us that are beneficial to them and run with them. But we can't let them do that. And so we have to protect ourselves. And these snakes in the grass practice a lot of these behaviors, where the big common theme with a lot of snakes in the grass, and with all toxic and manipulative people, is that they have these needs, and we all have needs. Teal Swan elaborates on this really well in an older video that she did. If I can find it, I'll link it down below. But it's this whole idea that we all have needs, and what essentially a lot of toxic people essentially do, the whole crux of what they do and the whole crux of their manipulation is that they have these needs and they don't know how to meet them in a normal, healthy way. So they start going about meeting these needs in a very roundabout, odd, strange, abusive way. And so instead of like, if somebody feels like they need someone to talk to, instead of just coming to their friends or family and being like, hey, I feel like I need to talk to somebody, they may instead like fake an illness and, or lie about something that's happening in their lives and kind of create this whole faux illness as a way to get people to talk to them. Or they might, pretend to break a leg and then be like, oh, I need somebody to take care of me and come over. And so they might do that, or they might kind of like initiate some type of phobia. And this, I'm not saying every person, I am not by any means saying if your friend breaks their leg, you're like, ha, I got you, Betty. I knew you're trying to spend extra time with me. Ha! Like, that's not what I'm talking about. But there are people who do kind of like, hey, like they have needs and they don't know how to meet them in a healthy, normal way. So they start trying to get them met in a roundabout way. And that's kind of what the base of a lot of these behaviors are. I mean, when we think of somebody who dumps their problems on you, they want to be heard, but they don't want to be heard in an equal way. So they have to manipulate the situation and make the whole relationship about them. And so there's an example of that. And so, like I said before, when I first met these people, they were very, very nice, very, very kind. They were face value kind. Their representatives were talking. But as I got to know them, I started to notice a lot of these behaviors. And these behaviors didn't start to occur until maybe I'd say a good 2 months in. Some people a little before. I'm kind of thinking about a group of people who I kind of met all near the same time. But, and I was kind of the glue that kind of held this group together. Like, I brought them together, but eventually I kind of became like a fifth wheel. But, at some point it was just and keep in mind, this happened very slowly, very much like a frog in boiling water, where, you put the frog in and I've never done this and I would never do this, but it's the old story where it's like, there's a frog, he's in a boiling pot of water, but the water's not boiling at first, it's just like room temperature. You put him in, he gets comfortable, and very slowly you turn up the heat until it's boiling, and the frog, it's just comfortable. And so when it was room temperature, you're changing the temperature so subtly that the frog's not noticing that you're changing the temperature until it's boiling, and then it's dead. And that's kind of what's happening with a lot of these toxic relationships and a lot of these very much snake in the grass people, is they start off very kind of very nice and as these kind of room temperature people, and then very slowly they kind of start up the antics or start up the abusive behavior or start up, whatever it is that they're doing, the dumping their issues on you. And it happens so gradually. Sometimes you'll see a distinct flip. There are times where you'll talk to people and they'll be like, oh yeah, this was when I noticed Johnny McJohnerson snapped or flipped, and I can even point to some examples in my life of people who was one day they were one way and then there was an instance where they kind of flipped. But usually it's not like that. People don't just flip. Usually if they flip, it's kind of like a slow motion flip. It happens very slowly. And sometimes you don't even notice it at first and you just kind of feel it in your heart. And I'm really, big on, I'm a very spiritual person, and my spirituality is a large way in which I navigate the world, especially my intuition. And I understand not everybody's spiritual, but sometimes the first indicator of whether or not somebody's a snake in the grass, usually you'll feel it first. Your heart will pick up on it before your brain does. And, it's one of those things where, I'm thinking of a specific person, and I recently ended my friendship with this person probably back in January, but we had been friends for about a year and we had known each other for about 3 years. And this person was the nicest, most sweetest person, and we bonded because we were very similar. We had kind of similar upbringings that weren't the easiest. We bonded, and they were one of the most kindest, most gentlest, most sensitive, in a good way, people I have ever met. And when we kind of started our friendship, we were like two peas in a pod. But as things went on, it wasn't until maybe in the beginning I noticed little things, but they weren't anything that was off-putting to me or anything that made me question their motives or anything like that. But I started to notice that they had a little bit of a victim complex, and they had this idea that I only existed to take care of them and be their caretaker, and it was really creepy and just weird and draining because I was somebody who was struggling in my own life, and it was weird to see them assume that I just had all this extra energy to take care of them. And so it started with exaggerating mental health issues, and as somebody who has mental health issues, mental health is important, and you can't weaponize it as a way to control other people. And this person would kind of like amplify vulnerability, like I mentioned before, would kind of lie about certain things or exaggerate certain things, would turn molehills into mountains, would just make the biggest deal out of little things, but not because they actually felt harmed or wronged or scared about these things. It was more just to get attention, to like be like, oh my God, come help me, come help me, come help me, just because they wanted affection and attention, not necessarily because they genuinely wanted help. And this was a person who had this obsession with having attention and affection. And so instead of just being open and honest and being like, hey, like, I really like affection, and instead of, you know, which even then I'd find that a little weird if somebody said that to me, I might walk away, but somebody else might not. And so this person was just obsessed with affection and attention and being the center of attention. And just this whole idea of people caring for them. And I don't know where that stemmed from, and it's not my job to play psychologist, and it doesn't matter whether it comes from a genuine place or whether it's coming from a manipulative place, or whether that person has dealt with abuse, or whatever the case may be. You are a person too. Maybe you dealt with abuse. Maybe you've dealt with abusive relationships. Maybe you've dealt with hard things. It is not your job to go play therapist with this person. And so, you know, this person would like lie about little things just so that I could come over and comfort them, or they would like, you know, exaggerate situations that some of which I had gone through and I hadn't reacted that way, and they weren't situations that were like super serious, but this person was making it super serious and was like freaking out over little things, lying about mental health issues, exaggerating mental health issues, and mental health is serious and that is nothing to play around with. And this person was like exaggerating things specifically to drain my mental health, and just to be like, oh hey, come and do this for me, do that for me. Like they weren't trying to exhaust me. Their main motives were not to exhaust me, but it was to get this need met, and they were willing to like drain me and run me into the ground and make me into a shell of a person in order to get that need met. And so this person just did some wild things. And again, I've noticed as a person with a mental illness, people like to make up lies about people with mental illnesses and claim that like, oh, if you talk about your mental health, you're being manipulative and you're trying to cop out of things. And that's not the case. But there are people in the world like this person who I'm talking about now who did do things like that. And typically they were targeting other people with mental illnesses, where it was like, you know, they were making their mental health my responsibility, and that was unfair because I didn't make my mental health their responsibility. And you know, they talked about themselves. They showed all of these signs where they were talking about themselves a bunch. They were kind of lying to me about certain things, taking up too much space. They only wanted to hang out with me when they needed something, but then would get upset, you know, if I took up space or if I needed something. Like there was just a bunch of things. But this person was the kindest person, and it got to a point where they very subtly started to change, and I started to feel very cheated in our friendship. And I also started to notice that my other friends were kind of looking at this person funny, and were kind of like, you know, why are you hanging out with them? And I was like, you know, I don't really know. And they were like, yeah, I had a specific friend, we'll call him Peanut. And Peanut, you know, saw this person and met this person like at the beginning of our friendship and was like, oh my God, they're so sweet, they're so nice, I love them. And then about a little bit into the friendship, Peanut pulled me aside and was like, yeah, like this person's really weird. Why do you hang out with them? And I was like, what do you mean? And they were like, Peanut was like, yeah, that's not the same person who I met. This person's a little bit weird and a little bit funky. I don't know what it is about this person. They give me a weird vibe, you know? And I was like, yeah, like it's okay. And even before Peanut said anything to me, I was kind of feeling the same way, and I was kind of like not wanting to acknowledge it, because it was hard. When you have these snakes in the grass, a lot of times you get caught up in the memory of who they were when you first met them, and then when they start to change, you're not like the frog in the water. You're not picking up on the changes, and you're just kind of like, oh snap, like, oh crap, like, what do I do? Like, you get confused, you get hurt, you get, like, you don't know what to do, and so you just play in denial, and you don't want to have that cognitive dissonance, so you just pretend like they are the person who they were when you first met them, but that's dangerous. And so, essentially, the best thing to do is to, like, leave that situation, but that's not always the easiest thing to do. And I'm going to get into that more in my next video, because this is getting very long, and I do like to make longer videos, and I want to make longer videos in the future that are about this length, but I do want to make sure that I'm not, you know, being too long-winded. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this off here. If you like this video, please subscribe. I'd love to have you as somebody who frequents my videos. That would be awesome. You know, I want to help as many people as I can. I also want to help myself. And so if you're interested, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay tuned for part 2.